Good morning, members. Good morning, Chair Shaheen, Vice Chair Busey, and members of the House Elections Committee. My name is Christina Adkins, and I am the Director of Elections for the Texas Secretary of State's Office. We thank you for inviting us to testify today at this hearing and for giving us the opportunity to talk about the role of the Secretary of State's Office, how we play a part in the elections process. The Secretary of State is the chief election official for the state of Texas. As the chief election official, the Secretary of State is charged with providing advice and assistance to election officials, candidates, lawmakers, and members of the public. It is our obligation to work to maintain and obtain uniformity in the administration of election laws across Texas. In addition to providing guidance regarding our election laws, the Secretary of State's office maintains and operates the statewide voter registration and election management system. This is known as the TEAM system. We provide both in-person and web-based training to election officials across the state. We certify electronic voting systems and electronic poll books. Everything that we do at the Secretary of State's office is based on the laws and statutes that our lawmakers have chosen to enact. And these laws serve to keep our elections safe and secure and to prevent voter fraud. I would like to take a moment to highlight two specific areas of law. First and foremost, I'd like to talk for a few minutes about voter registration list maintenance. Texas has a robust voter registration list maintenance program. This means that every day, our local voter registrars are investigating and potentially removing ineligible voters, deceased voters, and voters who have moved both within Texas and outside the state of Texas. We get data from a number of different sources. Most of those sources are from other government agencies. We're always looking for new data sources that will provide us with high-quality data that can be used in accordance with the matching criteria that we have defined in state law and state regulations. I would like to take a moment to highlight specifically the non-citizen list maintenance process because we've received a lot of inquiries on this particular process. What we are currently doing in this area was actually codified as part of Senate Bill 1 in 2021. It requires that the Department of Public Safety, DPS, send to our office information regarding individuals that have had a transaction with DPS and have provided documentation showing that they are not a U.S. citizen. This information is compared to our voter registration database, and for those individuals that were registered to vote prior to that transaction with DPS, they're sending a notice of examination requesting that they confirm their citizenship status. It's important to note that this is done on a weekly basis. That weekly basis is very important because it highlights the accuracy and the freshness of that data when we're performing investigations in this area. We have worked very hard with DPS over the years to ensure that this process and all of the other processes that we engage with DPS on, that these processes are efficient and accurate. Removing ineligible voters is one of the many ways that we preserve the integrity of our voter rolls here in Texas, and what other states do as well. This is something that's unique, or not unique to Texas, but common across the board. Though I will say I believe that the programs that we have in Texas that have been in place for many, many years are some of the strongest ones in the country. It's important to know that the voter registration list is the foundation of a strong election. Having accurate voter rolls ensures that we are protecting our elections from potential challenges, and this is why it is of the utmost importance and something that we place a high value on. I'd like to also go into a little bit more detail on our certification program for voting systems and e-poll books. Our certification program for voting systems has been in place for over 50 years. It started with our office certifying mechanical lever machines. Since then, our technology has evolved, and luckily the legislation or the laws that are out there have evolved with it. In fact, I think the legislature has made a concerted effort over the years to make sure that we have stricter regulations with respect to our voting technology to keep pace with some of those changes in election technology. We require all of our voting system vendors to obtain federal certification before they can even embark on the state certification process. At the state level, there is a thorough document review and an in-person examination by 6 appointed voting system examiners. And these individuals are appointed not just by the Secretary of State's office, but also by the Office of the Attorney General. All of our examiner reports are posted on our website so that the public can review their findings prior to our office issuing any decision on certification. So we definitely highlight and appreciate the transparency that the laws have placed on us with respect to those examiner reports. We find that having those reports out in the public provides folks the opportunity to learn more about how those systems work and to make sure that we have some accountability on the vendors when we make recommendations for changes. We do have a reputation nationwide of having a difficult examination process. It is very thorough, and we are not afraid to deny certification when appropriate. Since 2019, thanks to legislation from Representative Swanson, we have been required to also now certify electronic poll books, commonly referred to as e-poll books. And these are the check-in devices that are used in polling places when voters first begin the voting process. We are now in our third iteration of our e-poll book standards. Our standards define the testing rules and regulations and summarize some of our requirements that exist in state law that pertain to how e-poll books can be used. As we have learned more about this technology and its use in the field, our standards have become more defined and have become much stricter. We've recently released some updated standards, which include some additional testing requirements for all of our e-poll books. And we've also updated these standards to address situations when a poll book vendor is new to Texas or if they've been previously decertified. We hope to continue to grow this program so that we can continue to ensure that our counties are using technology that are complying with our laws in Texas, and we can hold our vendors accountable for the products that they're selling in this state. In Texas, it's important to realize that our system is one of extreme decentralization. All of our elections are run in this decentralized manner, which means that the Secretary of State's office does not administer elections. They are run on a local level by elected or appointed county election and voter registration officials. By law, the elected county clerk is responsible for running elections in each county. The county tax assessor is the county voter registrar. In over 130 counties here in Texas, those two duties have been combined to an appointed office of an elections administrator. Many of our local entities within each county contract with their county election official to run elections on their behalf. However, it is important to note that we still have a large number of entities in this state, schools, cities, water districts, hospital districts, that choose to run elections on their own. And those individual entities are also held to the same standard and must adhere to the laws in the same way that our county election officials have to. This decentralized system means that our local election officials, in accordance with Texas law, make all of the decisions related to the administration of their local elections and what best supports their local community. While the Secretary of State's office is here to provide support and guidance, we are not an enforcement agency and have limited enforcement mechanisms under Texas law. The 2024 election cycle was one of the most pivotal and most scrutinized in history. Election officials across the state worked tirelessly since 2020 to implement new laws, improve security, prevent voter fraud, tighten our election processes, and recruit and train election workers specifically for this 2024 election cycle, as presidential elections tend to be our larger turnout elections across the country. There are many stakeholders that are involved in our election process. In addition to election and voter registration officials, it is very important to note that a successful election would not be possible without the support and participation of the political parties, candidates, and poll watchers. Each of these groups play a vital role in the election process. It's through this coordination and hard work that we're able to ensure that our Texas elections remain secure, accurate, transparent, and accessible. While no election is perfect, and we did have a handful of issues, we did receive a lot of positive feedback about how the 2024 elections were managed and conducted in Texas. I am very proud of my team and of our partners across the state in having a successful election cycle. I will say, though, that the 2024 elections were not without their challenges. Over the course of 2024, our election community dealt with wildfires, flooding, tornadoes, bomb threats, threats to election offices, threats to polling place workers, and even widespread telecommunication outages. All of those things that I just mentioned happened during an election and during a period of active voting. In every single situation that I mentioned, voting continued and the election proceeded. This is a testament to the strength and resilience of the men and women that work on the front lines to ensure that our elections, the cornerstone of our democracy, continue in a safe and secure manner. Going into this 2024 election cycle, we knew that this was going to be a difficult year. The Secretary of State's office stepped up our efforts to identify and work with our support system across the state to ensure that our elections had the necessary support. On behalf of Secretary Nelson, I would like to acknowledge and express gratitude to the Department of Public Safety, the Department of Information Resources, and especially to Chief Nim Kidd and the Texas Division of Emergency Management for the ongoing and top-notch support that they provided to our election infrastructure across the state. They were a phone call away and in many cases sitting right there beside us as we faced these ever-changing challenges and threats to our election landscape. They were excellent, excellent partners, and we are very appreciative of the work and coordination that they engaged with us on. On a local level, our county election officials proactively engage with their local county leadership, including county judges, county commissioners, local emergency management offices, and local law enforcement, to ensure that that necessary coordination was not just happening across the state, but that was happening on a local level as well. We would also like to thank the Sheriff's Association of Texas for working with our office to help educate local law enforcement on election laws so that our sheriffs would be better equipped to respond to issues that arose to pose safety risks to election workers. These educational efforts and the support and coordination that resulted from these efforts made our election, but most importantly, our election officials and our polling place workers more secure as they were serving in these roles. When the headlines are all about the election results and not about the voting process, we consider that to be a sign of a good election. And we appreciate everyone that helped to make that possible over the course of 2024. We look forward to working with the Texas legislature as we consider legislation that will help us find ways to continue to improve upon the election process in Texas and to continue to support our efforts to prevent voter fraud and to have safe and secure elections. Thank you, and I'm available to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Atkins. Let the record show Ms. Morales Shaw is here. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Raymond.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, we have a wonderful Secretary of State. I love Jane Nelson. She's the best, maybe the best ever. I don't know. That's what they say. But I love her, and I'm very, very happy that the governor asked her to serve in that position. Loved working with her in the legislature, and she's been a great Secretary of State. I want to thank Gabe Valenzuela as well for always responding anytime I've called very efficiently, quickly, and I very much appreciate it. I wanted to ask just a couple of things. One, do you know, as I was listening to you, are there other states out there that you kind of look at as a model, or when it comes to elections and their processes, and or where we could get some ideas to make things better in Texas? We try to do that. Many states learn from us, and we learn from other states. Are there some examples that you think of, or do you know?
I think what I would say to that, sir, is that, our country as a whole has a decentralized election network.
Right.
And every state, runs elections in accordance to their state laws.
Right.
And I do work in close contact with my counterparts in other states. And so, I think we work as a community to try to identify things that everybody's doing well. And when we find something that's working, we try to replicate that as much as we can. I would say Texas is pretty consistent with what a lot of other states do, as far as we have worked very hard to emphasize election security over the last 6 years in particular. And looking at the legislation that's been filed so far this session, one of the things that I'm doing is looking at some of these potential pieces of legislation, and as they move through the process, I look to see how they're implemented in other states. And so it's hard for me to be able to identify a particular issue.
It sounds to me like you are,
but we are looking.
Yeah, you're looking, so that's good. It's
Yes,
just
sir.
always good to try to get good ideas from others. I wanted to also ask, I know, and Chairman, I don't know if you saw this, but I know that President Trump, I think yesterday, the day before, very recently, I believe I saw this, called for us, for the states, for the country, to go to paper ballots. Did you see that?
I'm definitely familiar with the sentiment that's out there and some of the
But
recent
did
statements.
you see President Trump call for that?
Yes, I'm familiar with some of the recent statements.
Okay, and so I wanted to ask, if I don't know, you're keeping, I will look with more interest now that I'm on the committee, and I've got a couple of bills that are coming to this committee that I have filed. But have you seen, has anybody filed legislation here in Texas with reference to what President Trump's talking about?
So I think it's important to recognize that our legislature has actually taken steps in this direction a number of years back. several sessions ago, there was legislation, I think it was in 2021, that eliminated the use of DRE, or direct recording electronic voting devices, to require that everybody have a paper-based voting system. So the full implementation of that across the state will happen by 2026, but I think we have all but maybe 4 counties that have fully converted to paper-based systems.
Okay, yeah, I guess you're right, because when I vote, I still don't really like this, but and a lot of people don't like it, at least in my experience. But you go in, at least in Laredo, you go in and you're doing this, right? You're doing this on a screen like this, but then prints it out, right?
That's correct,
So
yes,
that's
sir.
considered, we voted paper.
And that's because that printed piece of paper is the ballot of record.
Right.
So if there's ever a question about the results, if there's a recount, that's what we're going to determine what the count is, or to determine what issues there. If there's an issue, we go to that
So
printed
do you
piece
know
of paper.
when President Trump and others, not just Trump, but it's just, it's fresh in my mind. When he talks, or those who are advocating, when they talk about paper ballots, are they talking about what we have in Laredo, which you vote on the screen, you vote on a computer screen, but then it prints out the ballot? Is that what he and others are talking about? Or I see some
When
of the...
when you hear people talking about paper ballots, I just wanted to make that distinction that we already have in law a requirement for a piece of paper.
Yes, I know,
But what I think, what you're referring to, sir, is I think there are individuals that would like to see hand counted paper ballots.
Well, that's what I grew up with, right? That's what I grew up with. Like, you go, you get a ballot, you go in there and you fill out the ballot, and then you turn it in, right?
Or let me add, if I may add something
Yeah.
to that, maybe voter marked hand counted ballots, or voter marked pieces of paper, where you're not utilizing a piece of equipment to make those selections and mark it for you, but you have a pre-printed ballot and you're making the selections.
Right,
on
so
that
that's what
ballot
I'm
list
asking.
itself.
I guess I need to read up more. I mean, I look at, you've got the President of the United States advocating for something. I guess I want to understand, is he advocating for what I think is the traditional paper ballot, which is you go, here's your ballot, you go into your little booth, and you mark the ballot, and then you bring it back? Do you know if that's what he's talking about?
I'd be happy to review the statements a little bit more closely. I don't want to commit to an answer until I look at the words.
Okay,
But
that's fine.
I believe it's more towards that hand marked, where the voter's making those selections.
Check on that if you don't
Yes,
mind.
sir, of course.
And the last thing I want to ask is, it's a little bit of a delicate issue for us, for me anyway, because this is in Webb County. But I've had people come up to me, Chairman, and I'm working on a bill, and I haven't decided whether or not to introduce it, but here goes. So we have an elections administrator in Webb County, and I've had my staff check. I think counties that are above 250,000, there are about 17 or 18, I think, elections administrators, right? Like, I think Tarrant County has one, Hidalgo County has one, and, I don't think Travis does, but, Harris, I think, has, right? So in my case, the elections administrator also, and it gets paid around $100,000. I think it's around $100,000 a year by the county. But he also has a law practice, an active law practice. And I'm trying to find out if he's the only one in the state, or if there are others that allow that as well, because I won't say the names, but I've had judges come to me and say, this guy's running the election where I got to run. But then he comes in front of me practicing, and it makes me uncomfortable. Candidly, I kind of get that, right? I mean, the elections administrator is a very important position. So do you know, were you familiar with that, by the way, that we have that?
I did not know that particular individual had some outside employment other than being the appointed elections administrator. We have, it's over 130 counties that have that appointed situation.
Right.
I think what I can say to that is that there are some prohibitions in Texas law with respect to participation in political activities for our elections administrators, but I'm not aware of anything else beyond that, other than perhaps maybe county policies that might prevent other types of employment.
I don't think it, well, at least the little research that we've done so far in my office, he's not prohibited from doing it. And, so I'm contemplating whether he's kind of split the deal by saying you can practice in 253 counties, right? But maybe not practice in one. like the one where you're the elections administrator, you know, because you're administering the elections that elect all these judges. So I'm just curious, Gabe or someone could follow up and just let me know. And I'm particularly interested in the big counties because that's where you're going to get someone who's getting paid pretty well, right?
Absolutely.
The smaller counties, I still think we probably should look at that, but I'm guessing that in some smaller counties, they don't get paid very much. So there's a difference. I mean, but to me, if you're getting paid $100,000, that's not bad. So just if you would check on that.
Yes, sir, of course.
Thank you.
Ms. Swanson?
Thank you, Chairman Shaheen. That sounds really good. I'm really excited again that you're chairing this committee. Thank you, Ms. Adkins, and I really appreciate the way you've been very responsive to all the issues ever since you took this top-level job, and we appreciate that. We also appreciate Secretary of State Jane Nelson, and I would agree that she's the best ever. And looks like you do too.
She's
so,
a gift.
You're probably not supposed to make a comment. So, so a question right off the bat here: what is your definition of personal knowledge as it pertains to canceling or challenging a voter registration? Because there have been conflicts where people did know that somebody was dead or had moved. You know, their next door neighbor is dead. They know that, but sometimes the information that's collected, we've had elections officials that were like, oh no, it has to be family, and so they refuse to take that information from others. So I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
So personal knowledge with respect to this particular item you're talking about has to do with voter registration challenges. It's not defined in Texas law. And that has created some challenging situations. Our office did issue an opinion on this several years back, and I apologize, I don't have that opinion on me, or I think, read to you what we wrote there. I can get you a copy of that.
Okay.
But I do agree that this has been an area where there have been some challenges because it's not defined in the law, and I think some counties and county attorneys may take a different view on what personal knowledge constitutes.
Could you get one of us just suggestions on what you think would help? It sounds like we need to fix something in the law.
Yes, ma'am. I'd be happy to provide you with some information, some of the research we've done before in this area
Great.
as well. Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Teth?
Thank you, Chairman. How long have you been on with the Secretary of State's office?
I have been in this current role for 2 years, but have worked for the Secretary of State's office. It'll be 13 years in June.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you've been there a while.
Yes, sir, I have.
Can you give us an idea of the history of what you guys have done as it pertains systems-wise for clearing the voter rolls of ineligible voters that have moved out of state or passed or whatever?
Absolutely. So in Texas, we're actually very fortunate because most of our processes and the required data sets that we get are defined in Texas law. And so I'll use deceased voters as an example. For deceased individuals, we get data from a number of different sources. We work with Bureau of Vital Statistics. We get information from the probate courts, from the clerks of the court, the local registrars of death. All of this information is submitted in many times to the Secretary of State's office, but also to the local county voter registrar. There are some limited cases where we can perform the cancellation for deceased voters, but most of that information passes through us to the local voter registrar because they're the ones that are responsible for performing those cancellations.
It's not the responsibility of the Secretary of State's office then to make sure that a local voter registrar is accurate?
Well, I would say it is now to a certain extent. There was some legislation from this past session in 2023, Senate Bill, I believe it was 1113, was the bill number that gave us the ability to monitor compliance for list maintenance, and it gave us some limited enforcement mechanisms. And I would say what I have seen is since that law was enacted, we have seen much greater participation and much greater follow-through from our counties on acting on the data that we have sent to them.
How often did you have to step in and say these names needed to have been removed and they weren't removed?
I would say that we start working with the counties very early on. As soon as we obtain that authority, we develop some internal process and procedure and some reports that we could utilize to help us act in that way. And we started working with the counties immediately. So when we start checking on them and we let them know that we're watching this stuff and start asking questions about data sets that are there, what we have found is that they start acting very quickly. I can't think of a situation where it got to that point where we had to there has not been a situation where we've had to withhold funds yet. And so if it's data that I can see, and I will make a distinction, those of our counties that utilize our state system directly, our team system, without using a separate third-party vendor, I can see every action they take. I can see the letters that they mail out. I can see when they print those letters to mail out. So I know that they're acting on the data that we send them. For our offline county counties, they use separate vendors to help them with voter registration. I can't see what they're doing throughout the process. I can just see final results. But I can look at data that's been sent to them, and I can see if it's resulted in cancellations, if it's resulted potentially in somebody being put what we call on the suspense list, if it's related to residency issues. And so we look at those different data points to see if they're acting on that data. We have had some counties that have needed some nudging, and I think have needed to know that we're paying attention to this. But by and large, once they've realized that we were paying attention and monitoring, many counties stepped up their efforts in that area.
Thank you. We pulled out of Eric last session.
Yes, sir.
What role did Eric play in the past as far as helping y'all?
So, I just want to emphasize that we already had a robust list maintenance program in Texas.
So nothing, huh?
Well, I would say Eric provided us some additional data sets that we have been able to replicate from other data sources. And I will tell you that there's information that I can get, for example, from DPS that we were not getting before that provides some of the same things that Eric was providing to us. And there are other sources like that we're looking at. And I feel very confident in getting that data from other government sources and other jurisdictions and entities, because we are working on getting some state-to-state data sharing agreements. What I would say is I worry about putting too much on a third-party vendor. And I prefer getting the data directly from those data sources. I think that our office has found that when we're going directly to the data source, we can ensure the quality of that data. We can ensure the security of how that data is transmitted, because we're usually talking about data that has personally identifiable information. And that's a more direct route than going through a third party that aggregates that data.
I guess what I'm after is I want to know what we've done to tighten the system up. My daughter moved out of state years ago, and for years after, she was still in the voter rolls here in Texas. No one ever removed her. And it wasn't until I publicly stated 2 years ago that mysteriously her name was removed.
Yes.
So I guess what I'm asking is, what are we doing to tighten it up to make sure that we're actually on top of this?
That's a great question. We are always looking for new data sources. And I think that right now we are doing a good job with...
But I mean, clearly she had been removed from having a driver's license in the state of Texas for the better part of 6 years, and she still wasn't removed.
Well, and I think that's one of those data points that we are now going to start working with DPS on, that we have brought into our data enlist maintenance process. I would say there's one piece there, though, that I think has proved to be continuously challenging, and that's dealing with historical data, where somebody may have moved years ago before some of these newer processes are in place. It's sometimes harder to find those individuals, either because it happened in the past before we started working with a new data set, or their voter registration file doesn't have all the complete data that we need in it. We find with voters that are much older, that registered to vote before they had to use a driver's license number or social security number, we don't always find them with the data matching, because we can't get that high quality match if they don't have that in their record. Now, there's not many voters in that situation, proportionally speaking to our list, but that's the piece that I think is a little bit challenging, is the historical part, where we have since added, I think, some really great data sets and great processes to catch that going forward, but it's about the historical pieces that are in there.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Members, any other questions? Ms. Lisa?
Thank you so much for being here and for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have also some questions on Eric, but I do want to ask a question about Representative Raymond and what he was saying about hand counting ballots. Could you tell me just the estimated cost of what that would be to hand count ballots in our counties?
I do not have a number available to me at this time. There may be some data points that we can provide to you that might help give you a representative
it just sounds really
sample.
expensive.
I will tell you that we have been concerned in the past with respect to the primary in particular, where the state funds and pays for the primary election. We did some calculations for the previous primary that if every county in Texas opted to hand count, we would not have had enough money to pay for primary costs across the state. And that was primarily related to labor costs, individual,
Right. And we're already having a hard time getting people to want to work elections, right?
Many of our counties do have challenges in making sure they have enough workers.
Yeah, I was born in the 80s, so I don't remember that system. We've always, had a more technologically advanced system. So I was just asking how much it would cost to do and implement those types of.
I'm happy to look at some of the numbers that we had when we were considering the potential of this affecting our primary funding, and we can get with your office if that's all right after the hearing to provide some of that data. Yes, ma'am.
So I want to move into some line of questioning around Eric. I remember us voting to leave Eric. Can you tell me a little bit about why the state of Texas left Eric?
Of course, there was some legislation that enacted some requirements with respect to our cross-check program, which is what it's referred to in the election code, interstate cross-check, that indicated that we were not able to take on certain activities or perform certain activities that were not already required or authorized under law. And in participating in ERIC, they had some membership requirements, one of which was that we send out some mailers to unregistered households. That was not authorized under Texas law. So that because we could not comply with that part of the membership agreement, we had to withdraw from ERIC.
So the part that made us have to withdraw is that we did not want to or couldn't send voter registration information to non-registered eligible Texas voters?
What was stated when this bill was being addressed during the last session is that there are costs that are incurred by the state when we send out mailers, postage costs, printing costs.
Trust me, I run one of the most competitive elections out of the 150 members on the House floor. I know a little bit about the cost of mailers and stuff like that. So it was strictly on the concern of how much it would cost to send a teeny little postcard to eligible voters all across the state of Texas who should be registered to vote and engaging in their
Well, what I would say is that the legislation, that particular piece of our agreement, is what prevented us from participating in ERIC and required that we withdraw from ERIC.
And how much did that cost?
I don't have those numbers, but we can get that to you.
Okay. And so since we've left ERIC now, I've heard our amazing Secretary of State mention that we are going to create our own cross-check system. Where is the state of Texas at currently in developing that system?
So this is coming at the same time that we have been redeveloping our current voter registration and election management system. And we are about to roll out the updated version of the
I'm
team
super
system.
excited to see this. I've been waiting for 2 years now.
We're very excited about it as well. We've put a lot of work into making sure that this system is fully compliant with Texas law, but also safe and secure, particularly when it comes to transmitting data between the state and the counties. And so what we have done with this system is we have built some of the data matching capabilities and the data transfer capabilities, which is something that, again, from a security perspective, we had very grave concerns over, making sure that this data was transmitted appropriately. We have built that into the system, and then what we are doing is we are looking again at some of these other jurisdictions and other government entities that have the data sets that Eric was using and obtaining it directly from those sources. So instead of going through a third party.
Okay, hold on. So wait, let me get this straight, because now you've confused me. So we're using the same systems that Eric was using.
Well, what I would say is Eric was getting the data, they were aggregating it and doing their data work and then providing it back to us.
Okay.
We're not going through a third party, we're getting it directly from the data sources now.
That Eric was getting them from.
Yes.
Okay. And how much does the system cost that we've created? How much did the development on this system cost us?
Ooh, those development costs, that's another one where I'm so sorry, I don't have that.
You're going to have to get my office a lot of numbers.
We will come and bring your office a lot of numbers. What I will say to that, though, is Where we may see some costs related to ERIC has to do with more like subscriptions to some of these things and building some of these changes into our system. And we do have funding from the legislature on that.
How much?
But as far as how much money
Are you getting funding from the legislature?
So it previously was a rider in our budget, but it has now been rolled into the base budget, and it's $1.5 million.
$1.5 million. And how much did it cost to be a part of ERIC?
So ERIC had annual membership fees, and the annual membership fees, and I don't want to say something that I'm not 100% sure about, but I will get you that information.
I think it was about $100,000.
It was
our annual.
It was a little bit more than that, but I can't remember the exact number. But I would say on top of that, most of the expenses had to do with that mailer.
The mailer.
The postage
No,
and the
I
printing.
know those mailers are really, really expensive. So let's just kind of unpack this, because we've ran multiple elections now without having a cross-check system. And we don't want things like what's happening with Representative Toth's daughter to continue happening. We don't want someone who has moved out of our state and might be now registered in California or New Mexico to be registered in 2 states and essentially be able to vote in 2 states, right? And that might not be catched. So how are we cross-checking with other states now, since we don't have ERIC? Are we just calling Secretary of States up and being like, tell us about your voter rolls, or how are we doing this?
And respectfully, ma'am, I would say we haven't been without a cross-check program. We have been getting data. Prior to ERIC, we received data from other states, and that process has continued. We have been receiving, our voter registration list maintenance program, our data sources have been, that's defined in state law and has been that way for, I think, 20 to 30 years. None of that ended. ERIC gave us a few additional data sets that were helpful, but we have been able to replicate those data sets and find that data from other sources. And so nothing was paused. Our list maintenance still happens every day. We continue to get data from states on a day-to-day basis. We're just now, for some of the other data sets that we got from ERIC that we found to be helpful, we've identified other sources of that data and are building that now into our routine and standard list maintenance program that we've been operating.
Okay. So as we move forward, what measures can be taken to improve kind of that communication between us and other states? Because once again, Representative Toth, you bring up a really good point, and I know a lot of my constituents have also mentioned the same issue, right? And so how can we improve this communication to make sure that things like that aren't happening, to make sure deceased individuals are coming off our rolls? We know that sometimes those individuals aren't caught. So what can our state do to improve those conversations?
I think that the best thing that we can do, and it's something that we're actively looking at every day, is to try to identify new data sets that we hadn't had access to before, to try to find ways to engage in MOUs or subscriptions to some of these new data sets that are out there. Again, we have done we're doing a pretty good job with deceased voters as it exists today and on a day-to-day basis. What I worry about sometimes, again, are those historical situations where we may have found some great data sets and we can begin utilizing that process. That may not catch those individuals that have moved prior to or before. And so I think looking at maybe what can be done to review some of that historical data.
So I guess I'm trying to be specific.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what I'm saying is, how do we identify those new data sets? Because ERIC, right, was a much larger system, and they had already identified all those data sets. So I guess what I'm asking you is, how are we going about to identify those missing pieces? Because you're saying
Sure.
We're going to find them, and I guess what I'm asking is how?
Well, we've already found every data set that ERIC had. We've already been able to replicate that. There was only one piece that we couldn't get directly from another governmental entity or some other like a subscription or something to that effect, and that was voter participation, individuals that voted in each state.
Right.
But since that time, we have engaged with many states right now. We are in the process of finalizing data sharing agreements. So rather than...
Can you name some of those states for me?
We have one signed agreement right now, and we have many in process. I would have to talk to our general counsel about what I can say about those ones that are not signed at this time. but I'll say that we are targeting all of our surrounding states and then other states for which we have a strong Texas pipeline where we have individuals that move between those two states. I think we're very close to me being able to give you a full list. But again, because of some of the confidentiality rules, not just in Texas, but in other states, I need to double check with what I can say from a contract perspective. I'm not trying to prevent that information
And then
from
I
coming
just
out.
have kind of like one final question, and that's around y'all's communication with DPS, because I know that that's a really big portion of how we're maintaining our voter rolls. So I guess what steps can be taken between your relationship and DPS's relationship to enhance some of this data sharing?
So DPS is one of our strongest partners in this area.
Absolutely.
And we work with them on a day-to-day basis. We receive data from them every day. They have been working very closely with our office with the development of our new system to make sure that we are getting as much data as we can that would help us with respect to voter registration. I'm trying to think that if I've seen any legislation or any particular points that I think where legislation or data sets would help us, but DPS has been extremely forthcoming with us in providing us whatever they have. In anticipation of some other pieces of legislation that might be coming down the pipeline, we've talked to them about what they retain and have with respect to things like citizenship data. We already have a strong list maintenance process there, but we've definitely worked with them to figure out what we can identify on the front end that might be helpful. So we're already working with them on identifying folks that have surrendered their driver's licenses or have moved. That's already in work. We've been in the works with them on that as well. We have not had problems, I think, in obtaining or getting their participation, so I can't think of a specific data set or category, but I'd be happy to visit with their folks and continue those conversations.
I would love to meet offline and get some of those numbers about how much it's cost us to create a whole new system from scratch as opposed to the one that we had, and kind of some of the other questions I had. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Raymond?
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to, come in a little bit on what Representative Plessa said, and I know she said, I guess her experience has not been with paper ballots. I want to be clear about how I feel about it. You don't have to comment, but members, I think I said at the beginning, make it as easy as possible to vote and as hard as possible to cheat. And if my view is, I really don't care what it costs, because this is too important. And if we as a legislature get to a consensus that we need to change to where we have more traditional paper ballots because that's safer, it may take longer to count. I don't care if it takes longer to count, if that's a safer way to get a legitimate sort of outcome. And where, I think that if somebody who's 80 years old or somebody who's 28 years old goes to vote, and we pass laws that says you're going to vote with a paper ballot, I doubt the 28-year-old is going to mind very much. If they're going to vote, they want to vote. So, I'm not going to vote because now it's paper ballot. I'm not going to do it. I don't think that's the way it's going to work. But if we get there because we think that's the safest way to get to the right outcome, that is the right outcome being an honest outcome, members, I don't care what it costs. I just want to say that.
Ms. Swanson?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had one little follow-up question from what I asked you before. So for a voter to make a challenge on a residence, could you just give me your best definition of what personal knowledge is? I realize you feel like we need to clarify it more, but if we had to do something today, somebody's holding an election or they're making a challenge, just what do you think is the definition?
I think that we would need to include in the definition something that talks about or identifies the evidence that's presented with respect to that challenge. And I can give you an example if that might help illustrate it.
Okay.
We see organizations that do pretty substantial amount of work on identifying commercial post office boxes or commercial addresses.
Right.
And I'll use the post office box, for example. I heard of a situation where an individual looked and identified, 30 plus individuals that had the same address. They walked into a commercial post office or, a commercial store that has post office boxes, and literally stood there and matched up the address to the box. They could see the numbers where they were aligning. So they submitted a challenge because we have a process under Texas law It's a specific confirmation notice, not just the broad one, but one specifically for this purpose, where an individual has what we refer to as an impossible address. They took pictures of the post office boxes. They took pictures of the surrounding area and neighborhood to indicate that this was not a residence in any way that they could identify, and submitted a challenge. So they had pretty substantial research that they had done to identify that this was not compliant with the law. And there was a county that rejected this challenge, saying that you don't have personal knowledge, you don't know these voters. Ultimately, it's the county's decision because they are the ones that have to act on that. In that scenario, they presented some pretty substantial evidence to me that indicated they had validated those addresses. And I think I would have been more inclined to act on that should I have been in that situation, because it's not about knowing that individual voter. That's not necessarily what personal knowledge means. It doesn't mean a personal relationship with that voter. Another example I have is a situation where an individual had people that previously lived at their house still registered there, and they were receiving voter registration cards. Mm-hmm. And they submitted a challenge saying, these individuals don't reside here. Mm. And the question was, well, do you know them? And the response was, well, no, I don't know them. And the challenge was rejected. Now, there are many counties, I will say, that appropriately act, I think, and do their research and do their own investigation on top of what is just presented to them before they take action in that area. And so I think personal knowledge doesn't have to be about knowing that voter. There are other circumstances and other evidence you can provide that would demonstrate personal knowledge of the issue that's being challenged.
That's very helpful. So it sounds like we need to pass something that lists some of these things, that you're going to get us a list, and that mandates that they have to accept that.
I think any area where we can add clarity would help our voter registrars, because I think many of them, they have to rely on their legal counsel, their county attorneys, and I think a little bit more guidance in that area where it's less fuzzy and a little bit more clear and direct would be helpful.
Great. Thank you.
Chair Wilson.
Thank you. Ma'am, thank you for being here today, and you guys do a great job. Just a couple of questions, not to stir anything up, but just to demonstrate my ignorance in the questions I ask here. As it pertains to, for example, were there any paper ballots this last election cycle? The traditional, the ones
voter
that
marked, hand-tallied paper ballots?
Yes.
So in the Republican primary in 2024, there were several counties, Gillespie County that conducted the entire Republican primary with voter-marked, hand-tallied ballots. Travis County, the Republican Party counted their mail ballots through a hand tally, and those were obviously voter-marked because they were mail ballots, and those were hand-counted. I do believe there are other small jurisdictions, cities, water districts, hospital districts, that may also use that mechanism, but they don't report that data to our office. I don't have insight into how they conduct those things locally, so I'm sure there are other examples. I just may not be aware of them.
Okay, great, thank you. And as it pertains to the Gillespie County on the primary, how did that go?
Well, I think that would probably a question that would be better answered by maybe those party officials or some individuals from Gillespie. I personally wasn't present. We did have individuals that were there in Gillespie County, and I think there have been different accounts of whether people found that to be successful or whether it was something that they wanted to repeat. And I think that would probably be a better question as far as establishing the success of that election to direct to those folks.
I appreciate that, but as the State Department, y'all were monitoring what was transpiring across the state of Texas.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so what did you observe? What did the State Department observe, or the Secretary of State's office observe in Gillespie County?
Yes, sir. I think that what I would say to that, I would say a few things. One, Gillespie County and Travis County both worked with our office to make sure that the tallying method that they were using was compliant with state law. And they actually utilized some different form of tallying sheets that found to be very successful. And we did work with them to make sure that they were fully compliant. with Texas law, and I do acknowledge and appreciate that. The one thing, and this is something that I've warned about before, is that hand counting does take more time.
Right.
And so it was definitely a situation where it takes more time. That is well known, and I think that's what I would say we observed with Gillespie in particular, is that it was a lengthier process, and so results were a lot later in getting into the county.
How much later?
If I recall, the last we heard things that were starting to wrap up about 4 a.m.
And were these sequential ballots or?
We have a ballot numbering requirement in Texas, yes, sir. So these printed ballots would have had a ballot number on there that have some kind of, there's a numbering mechanism. What the law says is that ballots have to be numbered consecutively, beginning from number 1. These were your standard issue voter marked paper ballots, so that requirement applies to them, yes, sir.
And just for my knowledge, and I'm clearly, I don't know the answer to these questions. How was it? Was it just marked by a pen? Did they have to fill in a bubble? Was there a Chad?
For marking the ballot, sir? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, yeah.
Typically, what our Texas law requires is that you have a box or an oval, a shape, whatever your shape is on your ballot. The law was actually broadened out, so it doesn't just have to be a box. It could be an oval. And a person is given what we refer to as an indelible marking instrument. That's what the law says. So they're provided that indelible instrument, and they are physically marking their selection on the ballot. I will add, and our counties, have been compliant in this area, is that we do have federal and state requirements for what we refer to as accessible voting devices in polling locations. So individuals with certain disabilities can vote a ballot privately. And my understanding is that both counties, well, with Travis it was mail ballots, but Gillespie County was compliant in this area, that they did have that equipment available.
I see. And so they completed the tally by 4 a.m. the next day. Is that what you're saying?
It varied depending on the polling location.
Okay.
Turnout at a particular location will determine how long it takes to count.
Was this like where they did it by precinct or
Yes, sir.
at each precinct?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
In a traditional hand count situation, it's required to be by precinct, by voter registration precinct. So the individuals at that precinct, the judges and clerks that work there, they were responsible for performing the tally of those votes at that precinct. After they tally up those ballots, they then complete what's called the precinct returns, that are the official returns for that location. And that information, all of that, the counting, the ballots, the paperwork, is all sealed and secured and delivered back to the custodian of election records for retention. And then at that point, they can aggregate those numbers to find results countywide.
Okay. You had mentioned earlier that it's getting harder to find people who want to work in elections. Why?
Yes, sir. I would say, I will acknowledge that we have some, I believe, some county clerks and elections administrators that can speak to some of their specific
I know y'all
challenges.
are looking into this.
Yes, sir,
I
of
will.
course.
I ask them the same
I just always
question.
want to make sure that they're given that opportunity to address some of those issues that are
Yes,
personal.
ma'am.
But I
That's
will
fair.
say what's been reported to our office is, elections are a big time commitment.
Yeah.
And so it does take a lot of time. One of the things that I'm most concerned about is decorum, I would say, in a polling place. We had a number of reports in this past election with problems in polling locations where voters and other individuals that were authorized to be there sometimes created challenges for those workers. I will tell you of a specific situation in one county where there was some information about what you could and could not do in a polling location was being communicated out to the public and was not correct. It was about taking pictures in a polling place. And the voters were coming in demanding to take photos of their ballots and of themselves casting their ballots. And the workers were doing their best to educate and inform these individuals that this is not permitted in a polling place. And I think because of just the temperature in that area and the concerns and passions of voters, it started to become a difficult situation for those workers. There were reports to our office that these individuals had people throw things at them, threaten them. They were walking out to their car and people were throwing water and water bottles at them. And in this particular situation, many of the workers walked off the job because they could not handle that and that stress in that situation. that's one example. There are other examples where things like this have happened, and I think our polling place workers, these are individuals that don't do this work full time. They're volunteering their time, and we need to be very mindful of doing what we can to protect those volunteers.
Well, I appreciate it. I always tell folks, you hear things about, all the problems and whether elections are stolen, X, Y, and Z, and so forth. And in my opinion, whether cheating has been determined or not, if people don't have confidence in their election, then we have an election problem, period.
Yes, sir.
And so, and I know the Secretary of State's focused in that direction, building confidence and all those sorts of things. Can you tell me about any programs or anything that we're doing to get to communicate with our citizens so that they can more and more can gain confidence, considering all the disinformation campaign plans that are out there? You don't know what's true and what's not. There's a lot of fear, and then they find instances where there are those issues here and there. So what is it that we can do, or have y'all looked to do to build confidence?
So what I would say is that the best response to misinformation and to combat incorrect information is with correct information. Mm-hmm. And I think our office works very hard to make sure that we are putting out accurate and up-to-date information about our election process and procedure. In the past, we're very mindful, I think the Secretary is, with making sure that she's identifying important timeframes during the election process. So she very routinely issues news releases to make sure that we have accurate and correct and up-to-date information coming from official government sources. I think making sure that we're communicating that effectively on our website, which needs a little bit of updating our website, just from a modernization standpoint. But we want to make sure that's an easy area where a lot of people get information about elections, making sure that information is up to date and accurate, and that the website itself is easy to utilize so that people can get that information. And what we focus on in that area is always making sure that we are redirecting to official government sources. We encourage our counties and our local entities to make sure that they have that accurate and up-to-date information on their website, and if they utilize social media, to always direct back to those official sources, so that information we can be assured is getting to the public is correct.
I appreciate that. One of the items that have been out there is a concern associated with system breaches in person voter privacy and ballot secrecy.
Yes, sir.
And I think there's some ongoing things, and again, I'm not read in on anything in that regard, other than that the fact that it was demonstrated that you can run the piece and you can basically determine however it is. But has your office looked into those concerns as it relates to ballot secrecy?
Yes, sir. I think it's important to note every voter has the right to a secret ballot. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a constitutional protection for a right to a secret ballot, and I think preserving a voter's privacy and their right to privacy is of the utmost importance. We became aware of a situation right after the primary election where some individuals were using various data points, publicly available data, this is what we were able to confirm. Yeah. Through publicly available data, in certain circumstances, you might be able to identify an individual's ballot. So we immediately worked with the Attorney General's office on this to try to find resolution. We worked with many counties on this, surveying them, talking to them about the data that they have in an election, how that data is maintained and presented to the public. And we did issue some emergency guidance with respect to this issue. Again, this was in conjunction with many discussions with the Attorney General's office on what protections we had under current law to protect our voters' right to privacy. And there are, or I will say the Attorney General prior to this had issued an opinion. I believe it's KP 0463 is the opinion that indicates that when we're looking at election records and you're looking at precinct election records, that if there is personally identifiable information in those records that allow you to identify a person's ballot, that information may be redacted under current Texas law. So we identified this opinion and provided a list of potential data points that counties should be looking at if this is a concern and that they may need to look at pursuant to public information requests or in how they are publicly presenting that data outside of the request process. In order to be able to make those redactions, you have to seek an opinion from the Attorney General's office or an open records decision. And I will say the Attorney General's office, what has been reported to me by counties is they move very swiftly. They have been moving very swiftly in this area and have been very responsive to make sure that folks have the legal coverage and the correct permissions in place to perform these redactions. What I would say to that, though, sir, is that that has been a short-term solution to, I think, potentially a bigger issue. And I think, again, everybody worked very hard understanding that we were, in our 2024 election year, and there's not much that can be done to address that in that moment other than relying on what our laws already tell us we can do. But there are some things that, bigger policy issues and some potential discussions that have been happening, I think, that would address some of these issues, I think, in the long term. We had a short-term solution in place, but it's important to look at this not just in the context of this year and this election, but in all of our elections going forward.
Mm-hmm. The redacting piece. So we passed House Bill 5180 last session.
Yes, sir.
And I greatly appreciate y'all's proactive work on that bill. And essentially, members, that was the accessibility to the stored ballots after the 60-day mark. We basically had to get to common knowledge of when those records would be available. And so at 2-year mark, they can destroy the ballots, from what I understand,
yes,
correct?
Sir.
And so there was a lot of different interpretation, and we were able to provide some clarification so that accessibility to those ballots. So the redacting on those ballots, was it through the AG's office that was determined what needed to be redacted?
So we sat down with them.
Yes.
We met together in person and sat down and talked about this, and we discussed potential data points that even their folks at that office had identified appeared to create problems when you put all of these different things together. So we provided the list in the advisory, the emergency guidance that we issued, and that Secretary Nelson, wanted us to issue very quickly because this is a very big deal. But that was done in consultation with attorneys from the Attorney General's office to try to identify some of those data points. I will say there are two data points that have proven to be, I think, what most folks have been looking at. Location. The location at which a person votes seems to be one of those data points that
Are redacted. It's been
yes,
redacted.
that has been redacted. And then we have a situation sometimes in Texas where we may only have a few voters in a precinct vote. We have situations where you may be the only voter in your precinct that requests a mail ballot.
That's fair.
And so I think identifying those situations, those situations might need some additional redactions to protect that voter privacy.
I see.
But again, before a county can do any of this under current law, they have to seek a ruling from the Attorney General's office. And that's important to note because that's how we make sure that people aren't just over-redacting and that there are parameters in place, that it's done in accordance with Texas laws.
Okay. Thank you. I
Yes, sir,
appreciate
of course.
Vice Chair Busey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Atkins, thank you for all you do. You've been such a resource to all of us in our offices year after year. And Secretary Nelson and her time that she gives all of us to talk about these issues is very helpful. I'm going to want to change direction, but to just cap off the Gillespie County and the paper ballot primary, do you know how many ballots they were counting? How many people voted in that?
I don't recall the number off the top
I'll
of my
cheat
head.
for you. I think it was 8,000.
That sounds right, yes, sir.
That took, from my understanding, 24 hours of counting across, if you add up the time across the different precincts, and it took 200 people to get that done.
From what I recall, that sounds about right, sir. Yes, sir.
And in Texas, at the presidential election, we had 11.4 million votes cast, roughly.
Yes, sir.
So this was 8,200 people to count, 24 hours at a time.
Yes, sir.
And usually paper counting results in more inaccurate totals. That's not necessarily a question. I thought your point of what happened in Gillespie was well taken. And that was a very small number. and it was an incredible task. And I think if we try to do something on a statewide scale, we would have major problems. I want to talk about online voter registration.
Yes, sir.
We know that it's an efficient way of doing things. Are people in Texas utilizing online voter registration right now? Can you talk about that? I know we have a lot of new members to the committee about what happens with online voter registration in Texas and who's utilizing it.
So what we have in Texas, and this was, well, first, I think there's two different components to this. One, transactions through the Department of Public Safety, DPS. If somebody has an existing driver's license through DPS, they are able to make certain types of updates online. And those individuals that have made updates through the DPS process, they are able to also update their registration at that time. In addition to that, it was part of Senate Bill 1 in 2021. The language was broadened out to allow individuals that are currently registered in Texas, but may have moved, not just within the county, but outside of their county, they can update their registration online. So these are not new registrations, but they are updates to existing registration. Again, they could do that through DPS, but now there's a specific portal. It's through Texas Online, where they can make those updates and update their registration.
That's through y'all, correct?
Yes, Texas Online is actually hosted by DIR, and so but we get that data from them. Yes, sir.
And so these different portals that can be used, how many Texans have done this? And I know we're going to hear from DPS in a little bit, but do you know the number of Texans that have updated or changed their registration online?
I do have that data point. It's in a piece of paper over there.
Okay. It's millions. Right?
It is, yes, sir.
Millions of
Yes, sir.
Texans
It
have done
is.
this. Okay. So who can't do it right now?
Who's unable to utilize these online options? New registrations.
Okay.
If it's a new registration, you would not be able to utilize, for example, Texas Online.
Are we having any issues with the online portals that we're using for people updating their systems?
Not that I'm aware of.
So it's working pretty well to what you've known. You haven't had any red flags?
We have not
right?
had any systemic complaints or notifications of problems, no, sir.
So millions of Texans are doing it. We've been doing it for how many years? When did we start this program?
The expansion to allow updates from across county, that began in 2021. Prior to that, it was limited to just updates within your own county if you moved across town.
Okay, so millions have done it, but new registration can do it. So someone that just turned 18, someone that just moved to Texas, or just had never registered to vote, they're the ones that are being kept out of this process right now?
Those individuals would not be able to use that online mechanism.
Okay. Have you looked at other states that do it? Because I've got data that shows that other states that have gone to online voter registration entirely are saving money through the process because of how we do it now, where you fill out, maybe you're at a music festival, you fill out an online voter registration form. I mean, not an online, you fill out a paper voter registration form, hand that over to a registrar. They take that back to a county, or maybe it's a mail-in, but usually it's going back to the county. And somebody has to try to read your handwriting from that music festival, fill in that data, type all that in, and then hope they don't make a mistake, and then submit it. That's a lot of moving parts to get us registered to vote.
Yes, sir.
Correct? So we've seen in other states where more people have moved to online voter registration, they save money because you've got less people power and time to do this process. Would you expect the same thing here if we had more of these people doing it through that avenue?
It's possible, and that's something we can always look at if there's some additional data that you're looking for from our office. I'm happy to try to track down some of those data points, but I would say, sir, I think it's important that any discussions about any online activity, we need to make sure that we're emphasizing security, that this is done securely.
Absolutely. And the systems that we have right now are secure, are they not? Are they working effectively? You haven't seen any issues?
We have not had any reported issues on their security, and they do require authentication by an individual, to authenticate their identity.
Tell me more about that.
So what I mean by authentication, for example, DPS, if you are updating your driver's license through DPS and you need to update your registration there, you have to authenticate yourself as being that voter that has that driver's license. That's done by pulling data points off that driver's license, including what I believe they refer to as their audit number. But I'm sure my counterparts at DPS can speak a little bit more to that. And then with respect to Texas Online as well, there are some additional data points like that they have to be able to put into the system to be able to utilize it.
Let me ask also, when I fill out a paper form, I can make a mistake or whatever. I might tape it, or the person transcribing that can make a mistake. Talk to me about how the online portal can help prevent some of those mistakes.
So the online portal, for example, Texas Online, that is data entry that's done by the voter. For example, if you are needing to update a driver's license or social security number, or if you had, or let me back up. If you're updating your address and whatnot, it's retrieving the record that exists, and you are authenticating certain data points on there. And so if there's not a match between those data points, it would prevent certain types of updates that may not be authorized.
Do you ever get voter registration forms where people forgot to put in data points, so they just miss spots, or
Yes,
it's not
sir.
there? What happens in that case?
So that individual would be mailed what's called a notice of incomplete.
Okay.
So we'd hold that registration date for them. And that's very relevant when we're up to a voter registration deadline. They would receive a notice and have the ability to fill out a new form to provide that missing information.
Now, if we're using the online portal, all the fields can be required, right? So you're not missing a data point that way before it would
It
be
is
submitted.
definitely possible to program it that way. Yes, sir.
So that we could, in theory, through online, you've got the person registering themselves. They're verifying who they are under, a verification system you have. They're making sure they hit all the data points. We've had millions of people do it, and we don't have any real reported problems. Was that your understanding?
Yes, sir. I can't speak to any reported or systemic issues with our current system.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I think if we've had this millions of Texans doing it, I hope we will explore this session how we can find those loopholes for the few that haven't been able to do it. Because it seems to me that if you're doing this yourself and you're verifying yourself as opposed to a middle person having to put in the data, that is going to lead to the most accurate data possible. And also, is it quicker when someone does their online and we want to make sure we have updated roles? Is it a quicker system than through the mail process?
Well, when that person is authenticating and entering their information, there are validations that we have to make. We have to put it what we call through the live check process, where we're validating that this is a real individual. I would say for those individuals that are utilizing those systems, that validation is happening at that time, at the time that they are completing that online transaction. With a paper application form, when the voter registrar gets that form and they enter it into the system, that's when they perform that it's an instant validation.
Okay.
Or near instant.
Okay. I'm just trying to make sure we're having up-to-date lists and it's happening quickly to address some of the other concerns we've heard about. And through the online portal, we can do that.
Through that online portal, you would get a validation. For example, if we're talking about a DPS update or somebody that's utilizing Texas Online, that check, what we call the live check process, is happening at the time of that transaction.
Well, thank you so much. And the only other final note, and I think we had a lot of discussion on Eric already, and I'm glad to know we're finding those data points. I think if we want to have the most accurate roles we need across state check, and we're doing it. But it is surprising to hear that we may be spending 10 times more or so on the cost now. Or if you get us that number, I think that'd be very helpful for us because
On current costs, sir? Yes.
Yeah, just if we used to be able to do it for a little over 100,000. I know we don't have an exact number, but somewhere in the 100 to 200 range, and now we're budgeting. You said 1.5 million or so for it.
Well, that was the amount that was budgeted. That was the cost of Eric. I mean, those.
Okay.
It's not just the membership fee. It was all of the other costs associated with it, with those postage and mailing requirements. That was all wrapped up into that amount. So what's being allocated to us now is what was being allocated to us under our agreement while we were part of Eric. It's the same. It's the same amount.
Well, I think it would just be very helpful, and maybe we can get our chairman Capriglione and Doge committee to check. But we just want to make sure we're doing this as efficient as possible. And so, if Eric was more efficient, then it'd be good to know. And if we're doing it now, hands-on, and it's still just as efficient, great. But I also think we want to look at how we're saving taxpayer dollars. So
We are happy to
thank
get
you
you
for
that
that feedback.
information.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Toth?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just for some legislative clarity
Yes,
on
sir.
the reason why we kicked Eric to the curb is because it didn't work. It was crap. Excuse me, can I say that? I don't know if I can't say that. I redact that. It wasn't just the state of Texas. It was all over the United States. People were having problems with Eric. It wasn't working. And as Mr. Raymond said, I don't care what it costs. If no one believes in our voting systems and there's no integrity in it, then we ought not do it. The amount of testimony that we had last session and the session before last on the efficacy the trueness of Eric was just, it was overwhelming. That's why we got rid of it. It wasn't because we were trying to save any money. It wasn't because we weren't complying with everything with this through the Secretary of State's office. It didn't work. So thank you for getting rid of it. SB 545, which was Coal Course, HB 5259 became law last session, which is my bill. And it required dishes to Department of State Health Services to report to you. There was an MOU that you guys signed with each other that they would report death certificates to you. How has that worked?
It's been working well. We were already getting some information that allowed us to formalize and update our agreements, and we have not had any issues with that process.
So you're not hearing from the counties; you're hearing from dishes directly, right?
Yes, we get data sources from larger organizations, and we get them from county sources as well.
Are we finding any disparity between what dishes is telling us than we're finding that what's being reported back to us from the counties?
No, sir. What I would say to that is we get data, particularly when we're talking about deceased voters, we get sometimes that data 4 or 5 times on the same voter.
Right.
So we're getting a lot of reinforcement that a particular individual may be deceased.
Okay, one last question. We have a 12-day early voting setup now, 3-day break, which for those of us that work the parking lot, kind of welcome. And then an election day. What about the idea of just doing 13 days of voting? So we've got now just a 13-day voting period, not an election day, but 13-day voting period.
Single voting period.
Right, and the vote, the count, and the report all happens from the precinct.
There are a lot of states that do that already.
Why don't we do it?
That is a policy decision for the legislature, sir.
What are your thoughts on it?
I think that there are a lot of moving pieces with that, the single voting period. And I think, our office has talked to a number of members of the legislature about this particular point. So there are some policy decisions that would have to be made with respect to that kind of transition. It's a big change. But we are happy to answer questions on that and help identify those areas if that's the decision that our state needs to go.
Great, thank you.
Ms. Morales-Shaw?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Adkins.
Yes, ma'am.
This just goes to the validating the voter roll names. We all know that Real ID is kicking in. I think we've been getting notices that it's like May 1st or something like that. Is the Secretary of State taking advantage of that whole validation system to update the voter rolls?
Yes, ma'am. I would say we have been for a number of years now. The DPS non-citizen list maintenance data that we get from them, the reason why we get it and the reason why it is a high-quality data match, which means it's very actionable, is because of Real ID compliance requirements. That is why we have that confidence in that data that DPS is gathering. They have done a very good job in making sure that their documentation with respect to Real ID and what they retain in their system is very up to date when those transactions happen. So we have been utilizing that for a number of years on the list maintenance side.
Okay, good. And about what percentage would you say that resolves as far as validating the voter roll names if by May 1st we expect that everybody will have transitioned to Real ID?
So it's all about the life cycle of your driver's license and the life cycle of when you last went to DPS. So, and I use the non-citizen list maintenance process as the best example. So just to illustrate this idea, we started that process, as codified, through the legislative process in 2021. So anybody that has gone to DPS to update or have a transaction on a driver's license since 2021, between 2021 and now 2025, those individuals we have validated through the Real ID process, and we have received that data on that individual. So in a few years, once we have completed that life cycle of a driver's license, then we can feel very confident that the individuals that have had those transactions that maybe have been previously registered, that they will, at some point have had the opportunity to go make that presentation and make those validations through DPS. So it's a cycle because of, not everybody goes to DPS every year. They don't have a need to. But as they go in, we get that updated, fresh data.
Got it. Yeah, they don't go in at the same time, but my understanding is that this year, by May 1st, is the deadline.
And I will say DPS has done a very good job making sure that we are kept up to date kind of in their efforts in that area. And again, we are timely getting that data for them.
And based on the information that you have about how many voters or what percentage come in and use their driver's license, what is the percentage that will resolve as far as validating voter roll names? Do like a ballpark? Is it 50%? Is it 80%? Because I would think most people come in and use their driver's license when they come to vote.
That's an
even
excellent
though there's
question.
other
That is not a
IDs.
data point that I believe is retained anywhere. I don't think there's anything that tracks what type of ID a person uses when they appear to vote. But I can tell you anecdotally, from what has been reported to me by my counties and my state inspectors that are out in the field, it's a pretty substantial number of voters that use those DPS-issued driver's licenses and personal ID cards. So that's the majority of our voters.
Thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
Members, any other questions? Ms. Lisa?
Question. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Can I ask you real quick, what is our relationship like with the state of Alabama?
Our relationship with the state of Alabama.
Our relationship with like the Secretary of State of Alabama.
So I work a lot with my counterparts in other states. They're election directors, the folks that, on my level, perform election-related duties. And so, we have periodically worked with them from time to time. I know them from participation in different working groups and conferences. And so we have a pretty good relationship with almost all states with respect to kind of the nuts and bolts of elections.
And
at that level.
Alabama tends to be a red state or a blue state?
I think if you're looking at how a state
Votes.
their votes using, for example, the last presidential election, I think you would likely classify Alabama as a red state.
And Alabama has left Eric, or are they currently still in Eric?
No, I believe they've left Eric.
Yeah, so Alabama was actually the second state to leave Eric. And when they did, I just want to read you a quote. Their Secretary of State said that Eric is one of the greatest tools for election integrity, transparency, and accountability. He has also challenged states that withdraw from Eric to demonstrate that their state has a mechanism in place that accomplishes the goals of Eric. And so I say all that because I have some concerns that we might not have a mechanism currently in place that did the job that Eric did. And so as we move into this next state of elections, I think they start in about 100 days, right? I want to make sure that we are working together to make sure that we have a robust cross-check system to make sure that the deceased peoples come off our rolls, that people don't live in two states and technically could vote in two states, which we've seen is technically happening. And so I don't want to have any misinformation or conspiracy theories put out there. If we're going to do this right, I think that we should follow the golden standard that was set by Eric. And I think this was a bipartisan coalition of states that decided to use Eric, and it's a bipartisan coalition of states that agreed that that was the golden standard. Thank you.
Members, are there any other questions? Ms. Atkins, you've been great on the hot seat. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Chair calls Rebecca Hibbs from the Texas Department of Safety.